Early one morning, Harry was struggling to get some freight cars moved from a siding. They were needed for a mixed traffic train that Donald and Douglas were to take to Nantasket Junction.
Come on! I'm gonna be late for my next job!
He groaned. His wheels spun and spun. The reason why the cars weren't moving at all was because their brakes were set. But he didn't realize this and just kept on pulling and pulling.
Come on! He groaned. I wish I was moving instead of standing still!
Suddenly, the coupling between him and the first freight car broke, and Harry ran right into a siding, smashed through some buffers, and stopped halfway across an old tramp steamer. Luckily, no one was hurt, but Harry's front was badly bent. Skipper Stu and the harbor master came over to see if Harry was all right.
Well, the only major damage is bent buffers,
said the harbor master.
Oh, botheration,
said Skipper Stu.
Harry and Hamish were to collect the coastline flyer in an hour. Who can we get to take the train on such short notice?
Luckily, Russ was close by and heard everything.
I can take it,
he called out.
Are you sure, Russ?
The harbor master called back.
It's a tough train to pull.
Of course! We've got to keep the trains to time, you know.
Well, all right. But we've got to send Hamish to help out with the backlog while Harry's being mended. So you'll need to find another engine who can help you take the coastline flyer.
Yes, Mom, Russ tooted confidently. I can manage that. But as Russ got closer to Selgreb Bay Harbor, he remembered something he should have kept in mind before. The coastline flyer was an express goods train usually hauled by Harry and Hamish that stops at every harbor along the Seaside Railway. Starting from Selgreb Bay, it goes on to Grothlin and then goes all the way down to Grodinia Bay at the end of the line. Russ was worried, but was sure that he could find someone at Selgreb Bay who'd be happy to lend a wheel, just in case the train was too heavy for him to pull alone. Well, looks like I'll just have to ask the first engine I meet if they'll be able to help me, he decided as he pulled into the bustling dockyard. As he sorted out the containers for his train, he saw a little tank engine sitting on a siding, waiting for help.
Hello there,
he said.
You've got an interesting crane arm. Where's your hook?
I'm a reach stacker. I have clamps instead of hooks.
That's intriguing. I've never met a reach stacker engine before. Oh, beg pardon for not introducing myself. I'm Stepney.
And my name's Russ. I've got a big freight train to take to Grodinia Bay, but I'm not sure if I can do it on my own.
I'd be more than willing to lend a buffer,
said Stepney cheerfully.
I'm catching a ferry there anyway.
Great, honked Russ. We'd better hurry if we're to get the goods delivered on time. As the two shunted together the loads to hook up, Russ told him about his work in Grothlin and the many different engines he worked with, while Stepney told him about his time in Crotoonia, in which he'd been visiting to be part of a great locomotive show at Selgreb City Sheds, and now had to return to his home in England, the Bluebell Railway. Russ and Stepney decided to take the train in two halves. Russ would haul the containers, and Stepney would haul the other loads, tankers, fish, stone, produce, and products from the factories around the city. When all was shunted and ready, the two set off down the Seaside Railway with their important train. Unfortunately, they didn't get very far, as the first stretch to get out of the harbor was uphill. They tugged and pulled, but no matter what, the engines couldn't get their trains up the slope.
I'm sorry, Russ. This train seems to be a bit tougher to haul up than I thought.
You're right, sighed Russ. The coastline flyer is too heavy for both of us to pull separately, and if we leave later, we won't have time to uncouple each of the cars for the docks. Then, as if by magic, both engines came up with the same idea. They decided to arrange each of their trains into two new halves. Cars for Grothlin were coupled to Stepney, and cars for Grodinia Bay were coupled to Russ. Both brake vans were coupled together, then Stepney with his train, and then Russ and his train. With an engine hauling at the front and an engine to haul from the middle, the two could get up the hill and on their way down the line. The rearranged train also made it easier to drop off and pick up cargo at the 2 stops. Stepney's cars were uncoupled, and new cars of steel, fish, and lumber were coupled on. They made it to the docks just in time.
Well, it was a pleasure to work with you today, Stepney. It's a pity you have to go home now.
Likewise, Russ. But I'm glad your crew have such a good friend. Keep everything in order back home, and who knows, maybe I'll visit here again. Goodbye, Russ, and Godspeed. Russ then rolled home, confident, ready for bed, and glad he had found himself a new friend.
Stew is a very efficient engine. Being the dockmaster's diesel of Groflin Harbour, he always works to make sure the docks are tick-tock and on the clock. Unfortunately, this attitude does have a tendency to cause some, problems. One night, as the seaside locomotives were cooling their fireboxes and engines, Skipper Stew was rolling into the roundhouse. The engines were surprised. "What are you doing here tonight, Skip?" asked Oliver. "Passenger detail. The Seaside Rail Co. scheduled a test run for our new express passenger service for tomorrow, but the new engine she bought hasn't arrived yet, so I, of all engines, am to take the train tomorrow." "That sounds lovely," said Emma. "Not when you're the dockmaster's diesel. I feel like I should stay here and keep things running." "But we all help to do that," said Jones the Steam, "even whilst we have engines out of action. Like how I'm taking care of the containers while Russ is on holiday," said Gripper the Crane. "Suppose you've got a point," said Skipper Stew. "In that case, I'll keep this passenger run on the clock." And with that, he went straight to sleep. Next morning, however, showed that not everything would be on the clock. Skipper Stew, keeping in proper Navy fashion, woke himself up well before dawn. Unfortunately, the ship was still far out at sea by the time he got there. Trains came in and out of the terminal, and buses put-putted in and out for a good hour while he was waiting. At last, the big cruise ship carrying his passengers finally arrived and quickly boarded his coaches. Stew's train would only stop at the harbour stations, so the coaches were special for the long trip. There was a break coach, a luggage van, a sleeper, a diner, and a lounge, all coupled together for the long journey. At last, everyone was on board, and Skipper Stew was ready to go. "Tick-tock, we're on the clock, off we go, lads," he called out, but the coaches weren't ready. "The conductor's not ready! The conductor's not ready!" they called out, but it was no use. Skipper Stew was moving. Had he not been flagged down, he would have left the luggage van and the break coach behind. Skipper Stew felt very embarrassed. All the way to their first stop in Groflin, it seemed like nothing went right. Because they were late, they were switched off on a loop siding to let Yemon hurry past with some freight cars. Then, he ran into trouble with Donald at the salt mines. And to make things worse, the inclines proved very troublesome for Skipper Stu, causing the coaches to rock about and give the passengers an unpleasant experience. Passengers trying to sleep were given an unwanted massage. Hotcakes and bagels flew across the diner, and passengers trying to take pictures were given blurry results. At last, they made it to their first stop. The grumbling passengers boarding the main line connections and ferry boats at the dock got off, and some new passengers got in. Harry and Hamish, the express freight diesels, were surprised to see their boss worn out and stressed. "Oh, how do engines manage this? I've run this train to time, and I've run into nothing but trouble." "Well, we're not experts on the matter," said Harry, "but passenger trains aren't like freight," said Hamish. "They're right, you know," said a voice. It was Olwen, who'd been hauling Isabel and Dulcie while Oliver was working at the salt mines. "Passengers are not meant to be treated like soldiers, and coaches aren't meant to be treated like cars. You need to be gentle, smooth, and above all, relaxed." "So, don't order them on board?" "Correct." "And don't rock them about?" "Correct. Just be relaxed and keep steady." Just then, the conductor blew his whistle. "All aboard!" he called out as Skipper Stu tooted to say, "All clear." And now, knowing that the passengers and luggage were safely aboard, he started off. The ride up to Crotoonia Bay was much smoother. Skipper Stu didn't run into any loop sidings or jerk about on inclines. He just hauled his way up quickly but steadily. The passengers could sleep comfortably in the sleeper. The diners could enjoy their lunches of hot hamburgers, sandwiches, wraps, and soft drinks. And sightseers could take in the beauty of the Crotoonian coast. And when they arrived at the harbour, Skipper Stu waited patiently for the passengers to reboard his coaches. Then, they all travelled down the same route home, stopping at each stop without fail. Finally, he made his last stop late into the night. His passengers boarded the final cruise ship bound for the mainland, and the express coaches were shunted away to the yards. "Well done," said Dockmaster Eric. "I heard you improved a great deal after what happened this morning, and the express has been a great success. Therefore, I am proud to say—" "Thank you, good Eric," interrupted Stu. "But I do have my dockmaster's duties to fill." "Oh, I wasn't going to have you take over." "Then, what were you going to say?" "But I must stop here, I'm afraid, or I'm going to spoil the next story."
One morning, Sasha the little local puller engine was at the seaside roundhouse. She noticed Emma turning around to go to Selgra Bay instead of Crotoonia Bay. "Where are you going? Don't you have something to do?" "Not yet. Dockmaster Noisy wants me to welcome the newcomer." "There's a newcomer?" There was. A new engine had arrived to Crotoonia. Her name was Audrey, and she was quite a different engine compared to many of the other Crotoonians. She had a big, bulky buffer beam, smart dark blue paintwork, and a big, sturdy tender. She was about to go on her maiden voyage, and a large group of engines were there to welcome the new engine to the crew, with the newly christened Seaside Soarer. "It Hello, welcome to our railway. Let me know if you need anything shunted. How much coal can your tender carry? But Audrey was very quiet. She didn't seem to care much about the questions and comments. As Sasha arrived backwards, Audrey's first train set off for Graflin Harbor. Sasha saw the powerful engine roar out of the docks. She was impressed by how strong she was and how long and fancy her new carriages were. But then she remembered. She was a very small train, with very small carriages that had to load outside the platform. It made Sasha feel very lowly indeed. Sasha's job was to pull the local, a small passenger train that stopped at every station to drop off all kinds of passengers and workers. Captains to Selgrip Bay docks, miners and crane operators to Bartlett Bay, tourists to Graflin Harbor, beachgoers to Coast View Junction, and workers to Crotoonia Bay Junction. The days were long and busy for the little engine, but she loved looking at all the different things on her route. Cliffs covered in moss, waves rippling along the coastline, trees standing proud and strong on their perches, and small seaside towns busily going about their days. But whenever Audrey passed by, roaring with her carriages and important passengers in tow, it always made her feel silly.
I look at the scenery, making my passengers late, while Audrey is fast and on time.
Later that day, as she was on her way back, she ran down the little line on the cliffs of the salt mines, where she found a very shocking sight. There, blowing steam from what looked like every cylinder of her boiler, was Audrey.
Are you alright, Audrey?
Asked Sasha. Well, started Audrey in a very flat voice. Pistons are pumping, water pressure's good. Steam pressure, not so much. I do need to get these passengers moving again, though. They're catching a ship to Britain at Graflin Harbor. Then, Sasha got an idea.
I can take your passengers to the docks. That's my next stop with my train. Oh, but my carriages aren't fancy and glamorous. They don't have dining bars or sleeper beds. Just plain old seats and luggage racks.
Well, do you get your passengers to their places on time?
Well, not all the time. Sometimes the scenery takes away my focus and...
I mean, I don't blame you, said Audrey, to the shock of Sasha. This railway's got some pretty looking scenery. But the point is, if you're steaming and you got coaches, you're good. You got this, little bud. With that, Sasha had found confidence she'd never had before. Whistling,
"Peep, peep! Get in quickly, please!"
Audrey's passengers for Graflin climbed into her carriages, and the little engine set off for the docks. Sasha's carriages were heavier than usual, but she was determined to make it to the docks on time before the ship left for Britain. Her funnel was firing smoke and steam like never before. Her pistons rattled as she built up steam, and she was moving so much past her usual top speed that a local fisherman lost his hat to the sea, where a whale found it a fine new addition to its Sunday best. Finally, the little engine reached the docks, just in time for the ship to collect its last load of passengers. Then, Sasha hurried over to Skipper Stu.
"We've got an emergency! Audrey's broken down near the salt mines. We need the breakdown gang and dock as soon as possible."
"Leave it to me," said Skipper Stu. Doc and the workmen carefully examined Audrey, whose steam had dampened down quite a bit from earlier. Duck had already taken her carriages away, and Sasha had let Oliver take the last of her passengers home to bring over tools to mend her.
"Well, you're very lucky, Audrey," said Doc. "You just had a tad too much pressure built up in your pistons. Common issue with a new build."
Thanks, Doc. But you know, I'd have been a bigger goner without Sasha. She was the real hero of this situation. If she hadn't run so gallantly, a lot of people would have missed their boat. Wish I had the same control you seem to with all of those hills, I tell you. Sasha couldn't help but blush a little. It made her feel bigger and stronger than she thought she was. Audrey and Sasha are now firm friends. Audrey sometimes asks Sasha for help, but sometimes has to remind Sasha not to keep comparing herself to her. She's an amazing engine, just the way she is.